Hi, this is Stephen from SeaTravelRide.com. In today's video we're going to be talking about how to get to the Pyrenees. Part of any trip planning process is working out how you're physically going to get to your destination. So in today's video we'll cover off flying to the Pyrenees, catching a train to the Pyrenees, driving to the Pyrenees. We'll touch briefly on buses within the Pyrenees, and also for those in the UK and Ireland, catching a ferry across to either Spain or France and driving to the Pyrenees from there. Our own experience has been both driving and catching the train. We've driven to the Pyrenees a number of times from Paris, from Nice and other parts of the country, and we've also caught the train to and from the Pyrenees. So we caught the TGV from Bordeaux into Lourdes, and at the end of that trip we caught the train from Lourdes to Toulouse before jumping on a TGV to Lyon and into the French Alps. At the end of the video we'll also touch on whether we think you actually need a car to get to and travel around the Pyrenees, based on our own experience of doing this. So before we go through the different ways of getting to the Pyrenees, I thought I'd quickly look at where the Pyrenees actually are. And if you've never been to the Pyrenees before, never been to France before, not quite sure where everything is, this should help you orientate yourself with where they are in relation to everything else in France. So the Pyrenees are located in the far southwest of the country, and they form part of the border with Spain. They run, broadly speaking, between the Atlantic Ocean in the west and the Mediterranean Sea in the east. And the Pyrenees ranges are just under 500 kilometres in length. Given the Pyrenees are nearly 500 kilometres long, there's no one place people would typically go. Rather, there's different locations across that 500 kilometre length that you'll base yourself depending on what you want to do, whether that be hikes you want to do, cycling rides you want to do, sights you want to see. As we talk more about getting to the Pyrenees, there's probably three main towns I'll focus on, which I think are the major transport hubs into the Pyrenees. Those being Pau, which is closest to the Atlantic and the western side, Lourdes, which is sort of serves the central part of the Pyrenees a bit more, and Foix, which serves the Ariège and the eastern part of the Pyrenees. So you'll see those towns being referenced as we go through each of the different transport methods. So now you understand where the Pyrenees are in France, let's move on to talking about how you actually get there. And the first method of getting there I want to talk about is flying to the Pyrenees. Toulouse is the closest major airport to the Pyrenees. It's anywhere between 1 and 2 hours drive to the Pyrenees depending on which part you're going to. The airport itself sits on the outskirts of the city. It's about a 40-minute tram ride into the city centre, or about the same on a bus. You'll need to head into the city centre if you're going to use train as your method of transport to get into the Pyrenees itself, as the train station is in central Toulouse. If you're driving from the airport into the Pyrenees, the airport sits on the major auto route into the Pyrenees, and it's nice and easy to get to. You don't have to worry about going through the city or anything. You jump on nice big multi-laned roads pretty much straight out of the airport, which makes it nice and easy to get to and from. If you can't find the flights you want into Toulouse airport, then Bordeaux is definitely another option. It's a little bit further away, and it's anywhere between 2 and 4 hours away from the Pyrenees, again depending on which part you're going to. Like Toulouse, the airport sits on the outskirts of town, so if you're driving you don't have to go through Bordeaux city. It's nice and easy to get to the major auto routes that you'll need to get into the Pyrenees and get away from the city and busy traffic. If you are going to use public transport to get you to the Pyrenees, there's a bus service which gets you from Bordeaux airport into the major train station in central Bordeaux. They are in the process of extending the tram network out to the airport, and this should be open in 2022. So depending on where you're coming from or want to go to, either of those airports are definitely options. And you might find that you need to go to one over the other to get the flights on the days and destinations that you want. Within the Pyrenees themselves, there are two smaller airports. There's one called Lourdes Tarbes, and the other one is in Pau. Now these are much smaller airports. There's not as many flights on a daily basis to either of these airports, but they do offer connections to Paris especially, and they're more domestically within France. So definitely check them out if you've flown into Paris and you're working out how to get down to the Pyrenees. flying is definitely an option directly into the Pyrenees and either of those airports if that suits as well. So if flying to the Pyrenees doesn't suit your travel plans, something else you can consider is catching a train to the Pyrenees. France has an extensive rail network, and depending on where you're coming from or going to, it might actually make more sense to jump on a train rather than try and fly. Like flying, you'll either come through Toulouse or Bordeaux in terms of rail connections into the Pyrenees. From Bordeaux, you're able to connect to the TGV network, and it runs through Pau and Lourdes before terminating in Tarbes. So the TGV network through Bordeaux serves the western part of the Pyrenees only. From Lourdes and Tarbes onwards into Toulouse, you'd be on one of the regional trains, but then from Toulouse you can connect onto the TGV network across France. And we've done that. We caught a train from Lourdes into Toulouse, which is about a 2-hour trip, before jumping on a TGV across the country to Lyon and the French Alps. If you're planning on heading to the eastern part of the Pyrenees, the train from Toulouse runs all the way down into Aix-les-Thermes, so it gets you quite sort of deep into the mountains. It's one thing I will say about trains in the Pyrenees is that they service the foothill areas more so than sort of deep into the mountains. And what I mean by that, and you can see on the map here, so the trains will be great for getting to towns like Pau, Lourdes, Lannemezan, Saint-Gaudens, for that western and central part of the Pyrenees, but to get sort of deeper into the mountains, you're going to need to swap over to some other form of transport. It's not impossible, it's easy to do, but just be aware that you won't be able to catch a train right high into the mountains. Now, as I said before, if you're going to the Ariège and the eastern part, then train is definitely an option, and the train line runs all the way to Aix-les-Thermes, which is sort of deep in the mountains as such. So just be aware of that. As I said, we've caught trains before and it worked out really well, and it all depends on your own circumstances and what works best for you. So if you are planning on catching a train and wondering how long it's going to take, from Bordeaux to Pau via the TGV is about a 2-hour train trip. From Bordeaux into Lourdes is about a 2.5-hour train trip, and that's pretty much where the service terminates. If you're coming from Toulouse, then Toulouse to Lourdes is a 2-hour trip. Toulouse to Pau is 2.5 hours. If you're heading to the eastern side and to the Ariège and Aix-les-Thermes, expect about a 2-hour trip into there. If you're heading to Foix on the outskirts of the Pyrenees, then it's about an hour from Toulouse. So that just gives you some idea of how long you can expect it to take. The next method of getting to the Pyrenees that we wanted to talk about is driving. It offers probably the most flexibility in terms of getting to and from the Pyrenees, and you can obviously go from door to door and not worried about where public transport comes and goes to. You can see on the map here, the A64 is the major road giving access to the Pyrenees. It runs from Toulouse all the way to Bayonne on the Atlantic Ocean. Like the train line, the A64 gives you access to the outskirts of the Pyrenees, and you'll need to turn off the A64 and head deeper into the Pyrenees mountains depending on where you're actually going. If you're going to the eastern part of the Pyrenees, you'll actually head towards the Mediterranean on the A61 out of Toulouse before turning off onto the A66 down into the Pyrenees mountains themselves. To give you an idea of travel times if you do want to drive, expect about an 8-hour trip between the Pyrenees and Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. We've done that trip a couple of times now. It is a long day in the car, and we've also broken it up with a stop in Bordeaux for a couple of nights on one of our trips as well, and that worked well. From Toulouse into the Pyrenees, expect anywhere between 1 and 2 hours, again depending on which part of the Pyrenees you're going to. From Bordeaux, it's anywhere from just over 2 hours to 4 hours, again depending on which part of the Pyrenees that you're going to. Obviously traffic will impact those times, so if you're travelling on a busy weekend or something, you may experience heavy traffic. And we've seen that. Thankfully we were going in the opposite direction, but we've seen a tailback at one of the toll booths which lasted for probably 5 or 10 kilometres. So be aware that, you know, if you're there in holiday times, there will be a lot of traffic on the road, and, you know, possibly public transport then can be a better option. So the last way of getting to the Pyrenees that I wanted to talk about today is via ferry. And this will apply to people coming from either the UK or Ireland, where there's regular passenger ferry services coming from both countries into either Spain or France. And this is a great option if you want to bring your own car and not have to worry about car hire or anything else once you get into France or Spain. So there's a number of ferry services that run into Bilbao in Spain, and this is the closest to the Pyrenees. And from here, it's about a 3-hour, 4-hour drive, depending on which part of the Pyrenees you're going to from the ferry terminal, which is really handy. If you're heading into France via ferry, most of the ferry ports that are serviced there are in the north of France, and it means anywhere from an 8 to 10 hour drive from those ports down into the Pyrenees. Definitely a good option though if bringing your own car is something you want to do, and if you want to, break up the journey and go into other places before you get to the Pyrenees, it's definitely a viable option. So I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'd touch on whether I think you actually need to hire a car or have a car to visit the Pyrenees. The short answer to this is no, I don't. I think you can access the Pyrenees quite easily via public transport, but it depends on what you're actually going there to do and what you want to see as well. Public transport is available within the Pyrenees itself. There's taxis there, there's buses there, but they'll only get you so far. So if you're wanting to go hiking in the Pyrenees and will need to get up to trailheads high in the mountains, there's going to be no public transport there, so you're going to need your own transport. We've been there on cycling holidays, we've had our bikes there, and we've been able to use that as a form of transport. We found the times we have hired cars, for us, they've sat at the accommodation for the entire period and we haven't touched them. And we've always sort of thought it's a bit of a waste paying for this car that we're not actually using. So if you're there and you're planning on doing an activity that's going to be close to the town that you're staying in, and that it's easy to get to that town via public transport, then it's easy not to hire a car at all. There are plenty of car hire places also within the Pyrenees, so the airports in Lourdes, in Pau, the train stations around all have car hire outlets there. So it is also possible to drive to the Pyrenees and then leave the hire car with the hire car company for the period, or simply just hire a car for a few days if you need it. So that concludes today's video about how to get to the Pyrenees. We hope you found it useful and it gives you some good information so that you can get on with planning your own trip there. Until next time, happy pedaling.